If we haven't met, my name is Garrett and I work up here as one of David's assistant ministers. And as you know, the presenting issue which led David to call this conference is the government's definition of British values. And as David has written in what he's asked us to read beforehand, there are two immediate problems. One is that it's not the government's place to define values, and the other is that their different definitions are inadequate, and so can easily be used by them or minorities who have their ear to push their own agenda. For example, if by tolerance, one of their values, they actually mean affirmation of all belief or behaviour. So as a backdrop to today, it seemed the most obvious place in the Bible to go was Romans 13. So I'm going to read Romans 13 verses 1 to 7, if you have a Bible and want to turn it up. Romans 13, verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honour to whom honour is owed. That is clearly a passage primarily about living under government, but it is equally a passage about how to see government from God's point of view, with implications for how we seek to influence government and try to get government to understand itself. The main imperative is there in verse 1 and later repeated, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Being subject means recognizing our subordinate place in an order, in a hierarchy, and it's a God-given order. Verse 1, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And at first glance, that sounds like unnecessary repetition, doesn't it? For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. But the second part is emphasizing that those that exist right now, that you currently live under, David Cameron, whoever is your constituency MP, and so on, have been instituted by God, which, when you look at all they do that is patently anti-God's will, is hard to believe. For example, when you place David Cameron's pride in so-called gay marriage against verse 1, it is hard to believe. Or when I look on the Christian Institute's website at the voting record of my own constituency MP, he has voted, biblically speaking, the wrong way on almost everything in his entire record. Some of it doubtless because of his own sexual commitments. But Paul says, those that now exist have been instituted by God. In other words, what you have is from God. And we do need to remember that we have something compared to, for example, the anarchy in Libya right now. And you can say more than that. We have a very great deal, although a great deal of it is vulnerable. So we're to see government as instituted by God, which of course is why when Jesus wanted to get Pilate to understand his position, he said, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. So one of the problems with democracy is that the government thinks of the people as having given them authority. In the best scenario, to do what the majority who voted them in want. In the worst scenario, to do what they or the minorities that have their ear want, now that they've got the chance. But Romans 13 sees the authority of government as God-given for the God-given purpose of punishing and by implication restraining evil and the purpose of encouraging good. So verse 3 again reads, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad or evil. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain." And where it says government is God's servant for your good, the you is plural, the good there has got to mean the corporate good, which has got to involve the limitation of individual freedom. You cannot have the corporate good and a moral free-for-all. You cannot enjoy your car and me have the liberty to steal it. It's one or the other. It's not both. And the assumption is that good and evil are not what the 51% or the government say is good and evil, but objectively and universally good and evil. So that, as someone put it, when governments fail to stand for such goods as justice, they lose the basis of their authority because that is fundamentally moral, notwithstanding the number of people who voted them in. Now, if I used the phrase objective and universal good and evil in different contexts where I was not among friends, I would be laughed at. Because here is how one writer describes the prevailing mood today. "We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, and therefore obliged to make our behaviour conform to a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It is our creation now. We make the rules, we establish the parameters for reality, we create the world." In other words, we define reality. Things like marriage are entirely plastic, and we can define and redefine them, whereas the Bible says human beings, even those without the Bible, can and need to discern reality, not define, but discern something that's there. Because there is a natural or created order of things, such as heterosexuality, and there is a creator whose sense of morality is imaged in our consciences. The issue we have to face is that both in the public who are debating all these things and the government who we want to influence, that reality, those realities are both known and suppressed. And thereby comes the challenge. So, for example, all people know there are sexual relationships, quote, according to created nature and, quote, contrary to created nature, to quote Romans 1. And people opt for the latter in the name of freedom, not out of ignorance. Or, for example, to quote Romans 1 again, though they know God's decree that those who practice such things, referring back to his list of social sins, deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So all people have a conscience, but conscience is suppressed in the name of freedom, not ignorance, and suppressed corporately, as the end of that verse says, as evil is corporately affirmed. But in the face of all that, as John Chapman used to say, I still hear him saying this on an evangelist's conference, we must assume as true of people what the Bible says is true of them. We must assume as true of people what the Bible says is true of them. And the Bible says they do know God, and they do have a sense of morality. As someone put it recently, everyone has a morality. The argument is simply about the content. And that in turn becomes an argument about the basis for morality. And I don't know about you, but I think we need to pinch ourselves sometimes to realize the sobering and responsible position that we are in of having the most privileged knowledge, the most precious thing this world affords, as the coronation service calls the Bible. And the question for this conference is, how do we speak that knowledge into government, into the public debate? You can obviously take the route of critiquing what is going on, and there are all sorts of people in this room from whom I've learned that. For example, take so-called same-sex marriage. You can demonstrate that it is not equal to heterosexual marriage in that it does not form an analogous union. It is sterile as opposed to potentially procreative. And therefore you can argue that if it isn't equal, it shouldn't be treated as equal. So there's the route of critiquing what is going on its own terms. Then there's also the route of arguing from the social sciences, for example, showing that on average and over time, children from married families do better on a range of indicators than children from any other home arrangement, to use the newspeak. And the value of those routes is that neither requires the non-Christian world to accept the biblical premises that I am standing on and speaking from before listening to them. But the problem with them is that this is all about premises. The problem is premises. And we cannot duck that. We have got to be challenging premises. We have got to be talking premises and showing that only biblical premises support all of the values that are being talked about at the moment and adequately define all of the values that are being talked about at the moment. I think I have been teaching my grandmothers to suck eggs. I have nothing more useful to say by way of application, because that is why I've come to this conference. I feel out of my depth in doing what I've just described, and I'm looking forward to the wisdom to be learned. So around our tables, can I suggest now that we turn to pray in the light of Romans 13 and the light of the current situation and commit the conference to the Lord.